I thought my life was steady. Not perfect, but solid. I worked hard, paid bills, showed up. That night, I came home early and said, "I'm back," like always. Evan yelled, "Dad," from the couch. Mia ran and hugged my legs. Lena didn't look up. "Dinner's almost ready," I said. She answered, I asked, "Long day?" She snapped, "Can we not do this?" I sat down anyway. Evan said, "We had math tests." I smiled. "How'd it go?" "Good," he said. Mia said, "Mommy didn't help me tonight." Lena said, "I was busy." Her voice was sharp. I felt it, but I let it go. I said, "I can help after I eat." She pushed her plate. "I'm not hungry." Evan looked at me. "Are you mad?" "No," I said. "Never at you." Dinner ended fast. Lena stood. "I'm taking a shower." I said, "We should talk." She said, "About what?" "About us." She laughed once. "There is no us, tonight." I watched her walk away. My chest felt tight. Mark called then. "Hey," he said. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Why?" He paused. "Lena's been different." I said, "Different how?" "She came by the office," Mark said. "Didn't say hi. Looked nervous." I forced a laugh. "You're reading into it." "Maybe," he said. "Just saying." I thanked him and hung up. The kids went to bed. I tucked me in. She whispered, "Mom's mad." "She's tired," I said. Evan asked, "Is everything okay?" I said, "It will be." I stood in the hallway listening. Water ran. Then it stopped. I heard her phone. Lena said softly, "I miss you too." I froze. She whispered, "After the holidays we'll be together." My heart pounded. I thought, "Who is you?" I stepped back. My hands shook. I told myself, "Don't jump." She said on the phone, "He doesn't know." Silence followed. I went to the living room. I sat. I stared at the tree we hadn't decorated. I whispered, "Stay calm." In my head I said she wouldn't do this. Lena walked out. She saw me. "Why are you up?" "Couldn't sleep," I said. She nodded. "I'm exhausted." "Me too," I said. She went to bed without another word. I said to the empty room, "Get a grip." No one answered. I checked my phone. No messages. I said, "You're overthinking." My chest said otherwise. I remembered Mark's voice. Different. I remembered Lena's laugh. "No, us." I whispered, "Please be wrong." The house felt too quiet. I went to bed late. I lay beside her. She faced away. I asked, "Are you okay?" She said, "I'm sleeping." I said, "Okay." I stared at the dark. My mind wouldn't stop. I said, "Tomorrow we'll fix it." Another voice said, "Tomorrow we'll break it." I pressed my eyes shut. I thought of Evan's smile. I thought of Mia's laugh. I promised myself, I'll protect them. I promised, I won't lose them. Sleep came slow. Somewhere beside me, Lena breathed steady. I felt miles away. Before dawn, I woke again. I said quietly, "Tell me the truth." She didn't move. The words from the hallway replayed. "After the holidays." My stomach dropped. I knew then this wasn't a phase. I knew my life was standing on thin ice. I whispered, "I'm not ready." But nothing waited for me to be ready. Morning light crept in. I said, "Hold it together." I listened to the house wake. Footsteps. Doors. Normal sounds. Nothing felt normal. I got dressed in silence. I looked at the calendar. Holidays circled in red. I said, "We'll talk tonight." I didn't know that by then, everything would already be gone. I believed love meant patience. I believed silence meant peace. That night taught me silence can lie, and patience can bleed. I didn't know it yet, but this was the last calm moment of my marriage ever again. I woke up before my alarm. Lena was already dressed. "We need to talk," I said. She replied, "I know." I followed her to the kitchen. I said, "Tell me I'm wrong." She crossed her arms. "You're not." My voice shook. "Who is he?" She said, "Ryan." I asked, "Ryan who?" She looked down. "From college." I laughed once. "You're joking." She said, "I'm not." I said, "How long?" She answered, "Months." I said, "While I was here?" She said, "Don't do that." I slammed my hand down. "Don't do what?" She said, "Act surprised." I stared at her. "I trusted you." She said, "I lost myself." I said, "So you cheated?" She said, "I chose myself." The words cut deep. I said, "We have kids." She nodded. "I know." I asked, "Did they meet him?" She said, "Not like that." I said, "Answer me." She whispered, "Once." My chest burned. "You took them around him?" She said, "He makes me happy." I said, "I was supposed to." She snapped, "You stopped seeing me." I said, "I worked." She said, "You disappeared." I said, "I was right here." She shook her head. "Not for me." I begged then. "We can fix this." She said, "I'm done fixing." I said, "Counseling?" She said, "No." I said, "Time?" She said, "Too late." She grabbed her bag. I said, "Where are you going?" She said, "I'm taking the kids." I said, "You can't." She said, "I already packed." My heart raced. "They need both of us." She said, "They need peace." I said, "This isn't peace." She said, "It is for me." I lost control. "Please don't do this." She said, "Stop." I said, "I'll change." She said, "I don't believe you." I said, "I love you." She said, "I don't feel it anymore." I called my mom. "Susan," I said. She said, "Breathe." I said, "She's leaving." She said, "Stay calm." I said, "She's taking the kids." She said, "Don't shout." Lena grabbed the car keys. I said, "At least talk to Evan." She said, "I already did." I said, "And Mia?" She said, "She's asleep." I followed her to the door. "You're destroying us." She said, "I'm saving myself." I said, "From what?" She said, "From this life." The kids walked out with bags. Evan wouldn't look at me. I said, "I love you." He whispered, "I know." Mia cried, "Daddy?" I said, "I'm here." Lena said, "We'll talk later." I said, "About what?" She said, "Logistics." The door closed. I stood there shaking. I checked my bank app. Half was gone. I said out loud, "She planned this." No one answered. I sat on the floor. I said, "Get up." I didn't move. The house echoed. I said, "This isn't real." I looked at the couch. Empty. I looked at the hallway. Silent. I said, "I failed." I replayed every word. I chose myself. I'm done. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just sat there. I understood then. My life didn't crack. It collapsed. I didn't sleep. I laid in bed and stared at the ceiling. I said, "Get up," but my body didn't listen. The house sounded wrong without the kids. I walked into Evan's room and said, "Time for school." No answer. I stood there and whispered, "I'm sorry." I went to the kitchen. 4 chairs. 1 coffee mug. I said, "This is my fault." My phone rang. Mark said, "You alive?" I said, "Barely." He said, "I heard." I said, "Then don't say it again." There was silence. Then he said, "She took the kids to Ryan's place." I said, "What?" "She introduced him already," Mark said. I said, "She promised she wouldn't." He said, "I'm telling you what I know." My hand shook. "Did they like him?" Mark sighed. "Evan didn't talk much." I said, "That's because he's scared." Mark said, "I know." I hung up without saying goodbye. I sat on the floor. I said, "Pull yourself together." I didn't. Every room hit me. Shoes by the door. Crayons on the table. I said, "I failed them." Rachel called. "I'm coming over." I said, "Don't." She said, "I'm already outside." She walked in and hugged me. I stood still. She said, "You look awful." I said, "Thanks." She said, "Lena crossed the line." I said, "I pushed her away." She said, "Stop blaming yourself." I told her about Ryan. She went quiet. "She took them around him?" Rachel asked. "Yes," I said. She said, "That's not okay." I said, "Nothing is okay." Rachel said, "You need to fight." I said, "I'm tired." She said, "They're your kids." I said, "I know." She said, "Then act like it." I snapped. "I'm not strong right now." She said, "Then get strong." I said, "What if I lose?" She said, "You already are." After she left, the silence came back louder. I paced. I replayed fights. "You're never here." "I'm working." "That's not the same." I said, "I should have listened." I didn't eat. I didn't shower. I stared at my phone hoping it would ring. The next day I sat in Grace's office. She said, "Why are you here?" I said, Because my life fell apart. She said, tell me what you believe. I said, I believe this is my fault. She leaned forward. Why? I said, I wasn't enough. She said, that's not a fact. I said, it feels like one. She said, did you cheat? I said, no. She said, did you abandon your kids? I said, no. She said, then stop carrying her choices. I looked down. If I stay like this, they'll forget me. She said, then don't stay like this. I said, I don't know who I am anymore. She said, that's where we start. That night I stood in the hallway again. I listened to nothing. I said, I can't stay broken. I thought of Evan's voice. I thought of Mia calling for me. I said it out loud, slow and clear. If I stay like this, I'll lose them forever. I woke up and didn't reach for my phone. That alone felt different. I sat on the edge of the bed and said, enough. The word sounded weak, but it was a start. I opened my laptop and logged into the bank. I said, show me. Number stared back. Half gone. I took screenshots. I said, everything. My phone buzzed. A text from Lena. We need to talk about money. I didn't reply. I opened our messages and scrolled. Promises. Was. Gaps. I whispered, I see it now. I met Grace that afternoon. She said, what changed? I said, I stopped chasing. She said, how does that feel? I said, terrifying. She nodded. And? I said, clear. I told her about the screenshots. She said, that's not revenge. I said, then what is it? She said, self-respect. I laughed. Feels new. She said, it usually does. I said, part of me still loves her. She said, of course. I said, does that make me weak? She said, no. Letting her hurt you again would. Rachel drove me to Daniel's office. I said, I don't belong here. Rachel said, you do. Daniel shook my hand. Tell me what's happening. I said, my wife cheated and took my kids. He said, I'm sorry. Now breathe. He spoke slow. You have rights. I said, she says I don't. He said, she's wrong. I said, she already took money. He said, we document. I said, she took the kids. He said, we respond. I asked, can I win? He said, this isn't about winning. I said, then what? He said, protecting your children. Something settled in my chest. That night I organized everything. Dates, messages, bank records. I said, I won't beg. I practiced it out loud. I won't beg. It sounded stronger the third time. My phone rang at midnight. Why aren't you answering? Lena snapped. I said, I'm busy. She laughed. With what? I said, fixing what you broke. She raised her voice. Don't talk to me like that. I said, I'm talking calmly. She said, you're being cold. I said, I'm being clear. She said, you used to fight for me. I said, I used to believe you. She said, this isn't fair. I said, cheating wasn't fair. She said, I made a mistake. I said, you made choices. She went quiet, then angry. You think you're better now? I said, I think I'm done begging. She said, you'll regret this. I said, I regret staying silent. She said, you're changing. I said, yes. She said, the kids need me. I said, they need stability. She said, you can't do this without me. I said, watch me. She started crying. You're heartless. I said, I'm healing. She said, I'll take everything. I said, talk to my lawyer. She froze. You got a lawyer? I said, good night, Lena. She shouted my name. I ended the call. My hands shook. I sat down. I breathed. I said, you did it. I didn't feel powerful. I felt steady. I looked at the photos of Evan and Mia on my phone. I said, this is for you. Part of me still missed her voice. Another part stood up for the first time. I turned off the light. I said, I won't beg anymore. I started sleeping again. Not well, but enough. I woke up early and said, one step. I ran around the block and felt my lungs burn. I liked it. I said, pain means I'm alive. When I got home, my phone rang. Dad, Evan said. Hey, buddy. He paused. Why doesn't Mom smile anymore? The question hit hard. I said, she's stressed. He said, she yells a lot. I said, I'm sorry you're dealing with that. He whispered, Ryan gets mad when we're loud. I closed my eyes. What does he say? He tells Mom we're not his problem. I swallowed. You did nothing wrong. I know, Evan said. I just miss you. After the call, I punched the wall once, then stopped. I said, Control. Mia called later. Daddy? I'm here. Can I come home soon? Soon, I said, even though I didn't know when. Mark met me for coffee. He said, You hear about Ryan? I said, Only what my kids tell me. Mark leaned in. He's drinking again. I said, Again? Yeah, Mark said. Bar tabs. Missed work. I nodded. Figures. Mark said, He also borrowed money. I asked, From who? Mark said, Everyone. That night Lena called. She said, Ryan had a rough day. I said, That's not my concern. She sighed. You've changed. I said, So have you. She snapped. He's trying. I said, So were you once? She went quiet. Then said, The kids are unhappy. I said, I know. She said, They talk about you all the time. I worked out harder after that. I lifted until my arms shook. I said, Stronger. Grace noticed. You look different. I said, I feel awake. She said, What are you learning? I said, That I ignored red flags. She said, And now? I said, Now I see them. Another call from Evan came late. Dad, he said, Ryan left again? I said, Where did he go? He didn't say. I said, Is Mom okay? He said, She's crying. I felt no joy, just clarity. I said, I'm proud of you. He said, For what? For telling the truth, I said. Mark texted me. Ryan's rent bounced. I replied, not surprised. Mark wrote, Lena didn't know. I stared at the screen. I said, She will. The days felt quieter inside me. I cooked. I cleaned. I waited. I didn't beg. I didn't chase. Lena called on Christmas Eve afternoon. Her voice was different. Can we talk properly? I said, About what? She paused. About us. I looked at the window. Snow started to fall. I said, We can talk. Her voice shook. Thank you. I said, Tonight. On my terms. When the call ended, I sat down and breathed. I said, Karma doesn't rush. Just waits. Lena called early. Her voice sounded thin. Ryan moved out, she said. I replied, Okay. She waited. That's it. I said, What do you want me to say? She sighed. Things aren't working. I said, You told me they would. She said, I was wrong. I stayed quiet. She said, Aren't you going to comfort me? I said, No. She snapped, You're cold? I said, I'm listening. She said, I'm exhausted. I said, I believe you. She said, He didn't want the kids around. I said, I know. She raised her voice. How? I said, They told me. She went silent. Then she cried. I never wanted to hurt them, she said. I said, Intent doesn't erase damage. After the call, Daniel emailed me. We're filing today. I said out loud, Do it? He called minutes later. Temporary custody request is strong. I asked, Based on what? He said, Instability. Financial issues. Emotional impact. I drove to the school. Mrs. Alvarez met me. She said, Evan's grades slipped. I said, He's stressed. She nodded. Mia cries during reading time. I swallowed. She misses home. Mrs. Alvarez said, They feel safer with you. I said, Will you support us? She said, Absolutely. I thanked her and sat in my car shaking. Lena called again that night. They're turning you against me, she said. I replied, No one had to. She cried harder. You're changing. I said, Yes. She accused, You want to punish me. I said, I want stability. She said, I made mistakes. I said, So did I. Mine didn't involve betrayal. She whispered, I feel alone. I said, That's not my role anymore. She said, You used to protect me. I said, I protect my kids now. She sobbed. Please don't take them from me. I said, I'm not taking. I'm providing. She said, You sound like a stranger. I said, You made me one. The house felt calm after the call. I cooked dinner. I cleaned dishes. I said, This is what peace feels like. Daniel texted later. Court date set. I replied, Thank you. He wrote, You're doing well. I stared at the message and believed it. Lena called one last time that night. Her voice was small. "Can I come by Christmas Eve?" I asked, "Why?" She said, "Just to talk." I thought of Evan. I thought of Mia. I said, "On my terms." She whispered, "Okay." I ended the call. I didn't feel guilty. I felt ready. The doorbell rang. I froze. Midnight. I thought, who's this? I opened it. Lena stood there shaking. Eyes red. She didn't smile. Pride gone. She started then stopped. I said, "You're cold?" She whispered, "I'm sorry." I didn't move. She said, "I made a mistake." I said, "That's not news." She said, "I want my family back." I said, "Family doesn't return on a whim." She stepped closer. "I can't live without them." I said, "You haven't lived without them yet." She cried, "I need you. I need them." I said, "You lost that choice." Her voice broke. I was wrong. I was selfish. I said, "Selfish doesn't undo what's done." She sniffled. "I know, but I'm trying." I said, "Trying is late." I remembered the nights she laughed at secrets. I remembered the calls I overheard. I said, "You took months from us. Trust you never earned." She said, "I don't care about pride anymore." I said, "Then prove it through action, not words." She fell to her knees. "I'm begging you. Don't let this end like this." I stared at her. My chest hurt. Part of me ached for the old Lena. Another part stood tall. I said, "I'm listening. But this isn't a reset button." She whispered, "Please just let me try." I looked past her toward the stairs. Evan and Mia slept, unaware. I thought of their innocence. I said, "You broke their world. You broke mine." She said, "I'll fix it." I said, "Fixing doesn't erase damage. You hurt them. You hurt me." She crawled forward. "I don't care about me anymore. Just let me back in." I said, "I won't beg you to stay away. I won't beg you to return." She gasped. "You sound different." I said, "I am. I had to be." Her hands shook. "I've ruined everything." I said, "You've ruined choices, not the future." She whispered, "Do you hate me?" I said, "Hate is useless. You need change." She looked at me like I held the answer. I said, "The kids matter most. You'll have to prove that every day." She nodded, tears running. "I will." I said, "Words aren't enough." She said, "I know." Her voice broke into a sob. I don't deserve this, do I?" I said, "Nobody does. But love isn't a right. It's earned." She pressed her face to her hands. "Please, don't let this be the end." I paused. My heart waged war. Love versus self-respect. I swallowed. I said, "The end isn't tonight. But trust me, it's not automatic." She whispered, "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes." I stepped back. "We'll see." Her shoulders slumped. I watched her, broken yet awake. She whispered, "Thank you for not slamming the door." I said, "I didn't close it. You walked out of my life. You'll have to walk back in." She nodded, finally still. I said, "Go home. Sleep. Think." She murmured, "I will." I closed the door slowly. I leaned against it, chest heavy. I said to myself, "This isn't over. It won't be easy. But it's honest now." The house was quiet. The kids slept upstairs. I whispered, "I'm ready to protect them. And myself." I walked to the window, watched the snow fall. I said, "Christmas is different this year. And I'll make sure it stays ours." My hands shook, my heart steady. I knew some battles were just beginning, but for the first time I felt in control. The doorbell rang. I froze. Midnight. I thought, who's this? I opened it. Lena stood there shaking. Eyes red. She didn't smile. Pride gone. She started then stopped. I said, "You're cold?" She whispered, "I'm sorry." I didn't move. She said, "I made a mistake." I said, "That's not news." She said, "I want my family back." I said, "Family doesn't return on a whim." She stepped closer. "I can't live without them." I said, "You haven't lived without them yet." She cried, "I need you. I need them." I said, "You lost that choice." Her voice broke. I was wrong. I was selfish. I said, "Selfish doesn't undo what's done." She sniffled. "I know, but I'm trying." I said, "Trying is late." I remembered the nights she laughed at secrets. I remembered the calls I overheard. I said, "You took months from us. Trust you never earned." She said, I don't care about pride anymore. I said, then prove it through action, not words. She fell to her knees. I'm begging you. Don't let this end like this. I stared at her. My chest hurt. Part of me ached for the old Lena. Another part stood tall. I said, I'm listening, but this isn't a reset button. She whispered, please just let me try. I looked past her toward the stairs. Evan and Mia slept, unaware. I thought of their innocence. I said, you broke their world. You broke mine. She said, I'll fix it. I said, fixing doesn't erase damage. You hurt them. You hurt me. She crawled forward. I don't care about me anymore. Just let me back in. I said, I won't beg you to stay away. I won't beg you to return. She gasped. You sound different. I said, I am. I had to be. Her hands shook. I've ruined everything. I said, you've ruined choices, not the future. She whispered, do you hate me? I said, hate is useless. You need change. She looked at me like I held the answer. I said, the kids matter most. You'll have to prove that every day. She nodded, tears running. I will. I said, words aren't enough. She said, I know. Her voice broke into a sob. I don't deserve this, do I? I said, nobody does. But love isn't a right. It's earned. She pressed her face to her hands. Please, don't let this be the end. I paused. My heart waged war. Love versus self-respect. I swallowed. I said, the end isn't tonight. But trust me, it's not automatic. She whispered, I understand. I'll do whatever it takes. I stepped back. We'll see. Her shoulders slumped. I watched her, broken yet awake. She whispered, thank you for not slamming the door. I said, I didn't close it. You walked out of my life. You'll have to walk back in. She nodded, finally still. I said, go home. Sleep. Think. She murmured, I will. I closed the door slowly. I leaned against it, chest heavy. I said to myself, this isn't over. It won't be easy. But it's honest now. The house was quiet. The kids slept upstairs. I whispered, I'm ready to protect them. And myself. I walked to the window, watched the snow fall. I said, Christmas is different this year. And I'll make sure it stays ours. My hands shook, my heart steady. I knew some battles were just beginning, but for the first time I felt in control. I woke before the sun. The house was quiet, but it felt good. I said, time to make breakfast. Evan yawned. Morning, Dad. I smiled. Good morning, buddy. Hungry? Always, he said. Mia ran into the kitchen, hair messy, eyes bright. Pancakes. I said, yes. You help me flip. She nodded eagerly. We worked together. I poured batter, she stirred. Evan said, I like mornings with you. I said, me too. Much better than arguing. He laughed. Remember last year? I said, I'm blocking that memory. Mia giggled, spilled a little flour. I said, flour attack. Watch out. She squealed, ran around. I stopped and watched them. I whispered, I almost lost this. Almost lost them. Almost lost me. Evan asked, Dad? I said, yes, buddy? He said, are you okay now? I nodded. I am. Better than okay. Mia leaned against me. I love you, Daddy. I said, I love you too, more than pancakes. She laughed, hitting my arm lightly. I checked my phone. A message from Lena. Thank you for not hating me. I stared. My thumb hovered over reply. I said, not yet. I didn't want words to rush this morning. I wanted the quiet, the warmth, the laughter. I flipped another pancake. Evan clapped. Nice. I said, I'm improving. He said, finally. Took long enough. I laughed. Mia joined in, pounding the table. More? I said, coming right up. I carried plates to the table. The kids sat eager. I said, dig in. This is our morning. Evan grinned. It feels normal again. I said, it is. We make it normal. I watched them eat. I thought of the fights, the lies, the nights I almost gave up. I whispered, I survived it. And I'm better. Evan said, Dad, can we build a snowman later? I said, absolutely. You're in charge of the carrot nose. Mia jumped up. And the scarf. I laughed. Deal. We have a snow plan. I looked out the window. Snow fell gently. Silent. White. Peaceful. I said, I almost forgot how beautiful it could be. I sat down with my coffee, kids munching happily. I whispered, Betrayal tried to break me. It failed. It rebuilt me. My phone buzzed again. Lena, I'll respect your rules. Merry Christmas. I didn't reply. I stared at the window. I said, rules matter. Boundaries matter. Me matters. I felt no anger. No hurt. Only clarity. I said, I didn't lose my family. I found myself. Evan spilled syrup, laughing. I said, mess makers get extra hugs. Mia squealed, hugging both of us. I looked outside again. Snow covered the yard. Silent, perfect, untouched. I whispered, the future is unknown. But we're ready. All of us. I held my kids close. Warmth filled the kitchen. I said, this Christmas we own the morning. And our hearts. I took a deep breath, letting the quiet and laughter settle. I said, we survived the storm. And now we begin again. The snow fell steadily and I knew it was ours, our peace, our family, our start.